Have you ever felt like you're drowning in information?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to understand something really important, something that affects millions of people,
Uh,
but there's just so much information out there
right.
that it feels impossible to wrap your head around it.
Totally. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
And I think a perfect example of that is trying to figure out how a new medicine actually gets from the lab
Right.
all the way to pharmacies around the world.
Yeah.
Like all the steps involved, all the regulations, all the different countries.
That's absolutely.
It can feel incredibly overwhelming.
It is a very complex process, that's for sure.
And that's exactly what we're going to be tackling today. We're going to be offering you a guided tour
Okay.
through this crucial process.
I like it. A guided tour.
Yeah, we're going deep. We're doing a deep dive
A
today.
deep dive. Love it.
Okay.
So are we talking about global regulatory harmonization for drug approvals?
You got it. That's
Yeah.
exactly what we're diving into.
Okay, great. Because for this deep dive, I have been looking at a ton of materials. Everything from the guidelines issued by regulatory bodies,
Okay.
like the FDA, that's the U.S. Food and Drug Administration,
Right.
the agency that makes sure all our medicines in the United States are safe and effective.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH,
Okay.
to analyses of the drug development journey itself, and even some really interesting case studies.
So we've got like the rule books.
Yes.
And then we've got how it actually works in practice.
Yeah, we're looking at both sides of the coin.
I love it.
Our goal with all of this is to extract the core knowledge that you need to understand this vital area.
Exactly. Because whether you're like me and you're just fascinated by how this whole thing works,
Right.
or maybe you're prepping for a big meeting and you need to get up to speed quickly,
Yeah, that makes sense.
or maybe you just want to be in the know, you want to be able to hold your own in a conversation, this deep dive is for you.
Perfect. Sounds like we've got a good plan.
Yeah. And our mission today is very straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
To unpack all of the global efforts that are aimed at making drug approval standards more aligned across the world.
I see.
And crucially, we want to understand what this all means for patients who are waiting for those new therapies.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? How does all this impact patients at the end of the day?
Exactly.
All right, so where do we even begin with something this big? It's a huge topic.
It is huge. And I think a good place to start would be with the challenge.
Okay.
The challenge of diversity and regulatory standards.
Right, because around the globe, things are not the same everywhere.
They are not. And historically, they have been very, very different.
Right.
So if you think about like the major players, right, you've got the U.S. with the FDA.
Yep.
You've got Europe with the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, which is kind of like their equivalent of the FDA, but for the entire European Union.
Right, a central authority for drug approval.
Exactly, yeah. And then you've got Japan with their Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency, the PMDA.
PMDA, yep. Got it. So we've got these major markets.
Huge market.
But for a long time, each of them was operating with its own very distinct rules and expectations for what a company had to prove to get a drug approved.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was, and it was really tough for drug developers. Because if you're a company and you've poured your heart and soul into this potentially life-saving drug, and you want to bring it to people worldwide, you're suddenly faced with all these different hoops to jump through in each region.
So are we talking like they had to essentially reinvent the wheel multiple times?
Essentially, yes, you had this patchwork of regulations, and it meant that companies would have to spend so much time, money, resources developing separate applications, sometimes even slightly different preclinical studies.
Like the early ones with the animals and in the lab.
Exactly, those early stage tests. And even the clinical trials, the studies with human volunteers might need variations just to satisfy the FDA versus the EMA versus the PMDA.
Wow, that sounds incredibly inefficient.
It was, there's no doubt about it.
And I mean, I imagine that inefficiency could actually have real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
Like potentially delaying the availability of new medicines for people who need them.
That's exactly right. It could slow down the whole process significantly.
So something had to change.
Yeah, it was clear that things couldn't continue that way.
So what sparked the move towards harmonization? Like how did people start trying to fix this mess?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So, recognizing all these challenges, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was this pivotal initiative that emerged. The International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use.
Oh, wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is, but thankfully we just call it ICH.
Okay, the ICH. So this was like a light bulb moment. Like, hey, let's all get together and try to figure this out.
It was a major step forward. The ICH brought together the regulatory authorities and the pharmaceutical industry from these major regions to try and find some common ground on the technical requirements for drug registration.
So the ICH is like this big international forum where regulators from different countries sit down and try to agree on a common set of rules for drug approvals.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay. And who are like the key players? Who's sitting at that table?
The core participants have always been the agencies from those big influential regions we talked about.
Yeah.
The FDA from the US, the EMA in Europe, and the PMDA in Japan.
Got it.
And the ICH provides a platform for them to come together in consultation with the pharmaceutical industry, of course.
Right.
And try to reach a consensus on scientific and technical guidelines.
Okay, so they're hashing out the details of what good science looks like.
Exactly.
So, if they all agree on something, does that automatically become law everywhere?
That's an important point. While ICH guidelines are super influential and widely adopted, the ICH itself doesn't have the legal authority to force countries to follow them.
I see.
It's more like a really strong recommendation, a gold standard, if you will.
Like, we all agree this is the best way to do it.
Exactly. It's a best practices guide for the whole world.
Okay, so we've got this push for harmonization.
Right.
But how does it actually play out in the real world?
Okay, great question. So let's think about the entire process of developing a new medicine.
Okay.
From those first ideas in the lab all the way to submitting all the paperwork for approval.
It's like the entire journey.
The whole thing.
Right.
And harmonization efforts actually impact almost every single stage.
Wow.
For example, let's start with preclinical and non-clinical programs.
So this is like before it even gets to humans.
Exactly, the very early stages.
Okay.
The ICH aims to create more consistent guidance on the types of studies needed to evaluate a drug's safety and potential effectiveness before it ever reaches a human being.
So this is all about making sure it's even worth testing in people.
Exactly. And the idea is to reduce the need for companies to conduct the same studies multiple times in different regions.
Oh, I see.
Just because each country has slightly different rules.
So streamline that early process.
Yeah, make it more efficient, save time and resources.
Make a lot of sense.
It does, and it allows those resources to be used elsewhere, which is really important.
Okay, so what about clinical trials? I mean, that feels like a super critical stage.
It is. It's where we really start to see how the drug works in humans. And you can imagine in the past, there might have been different ethical or scientific standards, which would make things very complicated.
So how has the ICH tackled that?
They've actually made huge progress in this area.
Okay, good.
They've developed really comprehensive guidelines covering all the ethical and scientific principles that should govern how clinical trials are designed, conducted, recorded, and reported.
So like a global rule book for running these trials.
Exactly. And it's often referred to as Good Clinical Practice, or GCP for short.
GCP, got it.
And by sticking to these ICH GCP guidelines, companies can be much more confident that the data they generate from their clinical trials in one region will be accepted by regulatory agencies in other ICH countries.
So they're not going to get pushback from the FDA if they ran their trials in Europe, according to these guidelines?
Ideally, no.
Yeah.
It builds trust and makes the whole process much smoother.
So it's about making sure everyone's speaking the same language when it comes to clinical trials.
Exactly. It's about setting a global standard for quality and reliability.
That makes sense.
It makes the global evaluation of a drug much more streamlined, which is good news for everyone.
It sounds like a win-win.
It is, and it helps get those treatments to people who need them faster.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered the early research in clinical trials. What about the final step?
You mean the actual application process for drug approval?
Yeah, like all the paperwork, the data, the big submission.
Right, what's often called the regulatory submission. It's a big deal. It involves compiling everything they've learned about the drug.
Everything?
Everything. All the data, all the findings. And the ICH has also been working to harmonize the technical requirements for what information needs to be included in these submissions.
Okay. So they're trying to make it so companies don't have to create completely different applications for every country.
That's exactly it. It's about reducing that burden and making the process more efficient.
So instead of having to create like a separate dossier for the FDA and a separate one for the EMA and another one for the PMDA.
Yeah, it's a lot of paperwork.
It's more like one standardized package that everyone can work with.
You got it. It's a huge step towards streamlining the global approval process.
So it sounds like this global regulatory harmonization has the potential to be really beneficial.
It does. It's about working smarter, not harder.
But in practical terms, what are the biggest advantages?
Well, first and foremost, as we've been talking about, it cuts down on redundancy.
Like all those repeated studies we talked about.
Exactly. Companies can potentially avoid having to repeat those expensive and time-consuming studies just because different regions have slightly different rules.
Saves time, saves money.
Huge cost savings, which is a big deal for these companies.
Right, because that frees up resources to invest in more research and development.
Precisely. It allows them to focus on innovation and bringing new treatments to market.
And then ultimately that benefits patients.
Absolutely. That's the whole point.
Because if things are more efficient and streamlined, those promising new drugs can get to the people who need them faster.
Exactly. And that's especially important for diseases where there aren't a lot of good treatment options currently available.
Right. Like if we're facing a global health crisis, we need to be able to get those treatments out there as quickly and safely as possible.
And harmonization can definitely help with that.
So it's about speed, but it's also about efficiency across the entire process.
It is. It's about making the whole drug development lifecycle more efficient, from the initial discovery all the way to a patient being able to access the treatment.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
But even with all these efforts, I have to imagine there are still some differences.
Oh, for sure.
In how drugs are approved around the world.
Yeah, it's not a perfectly uniform system.
It can't be that simple, right?
It would be lovely if it were, but the reality is a bit more complicated.
So what are some of the things that are still different? Like where do those variations still exist?
Okay, so a big one is that while the ICH provides a really valuable framework and a lot of guidance, local country regulations still play a big role.
Right. Every country has its own specific laws.
Exactly. So even if a company has followed all the ICH guidelines to the letter, they still have to meet the specific requirements of each country where they want to sell their product.
So it's like ICH sets the international baseline,
right?
But then each country adds its own layer of specific rules on top of that.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Like, let's say a company wants to market their drug in China. Even if they've met all the ICH standards, they might still need to adjust their manufacturing processes or meet specific conditions for marketing authorization that are unique to China.
So there's still that local adaptation that needs to happen.
Exactly. The ICH helps harmonize things, but it doesn't completely erase those national differences.
Makes sense. And what about the legal power of these guidelines? Like, we talked about how the ICH doesn't have the authority to enforce its recommendations.
Right. That's a key point. So in the United States, for example, the FDA's regulations, like those found in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, those are legally binding. They are the law of the land.
So companies have to follow those FDA regulations, no questions asked.
Yep. Those are non-negotiable. But ICH guidelines, on the other hand, they represent a consensus view, a set of best practices that were developed collaboratively. Agencies like the FDA can choose to adopt and implement those guidelines, which effectively makes them part of their requirements. But the ICH itself can't punish a country for not following them.
So it's like a strong suggestion, but not a legal mandate.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about collaboration and consensus building.
So the ICH facilitates the agreement, but ultimately it's up to each individual agency like the FDA or the PMDA to actually give that final stamp of approval.
They hold the power within their own territories.
So in this more harmonized world, what's the role of those agencies then? Like, how are they adapting their review processes?
Their core responsibility hasn't changed. They still have to independently review and approve new drugs and medical devices within their own countries or regions.
Right. They're still the gatekeepers.
Absolutely. They're the ones who carefully evaluate all the scientific data submitted by companies and determine if a product is truly safe and effective for its intended use.
And that's a huge responsibility.
It is. They're protecting the public health.
So even though there's this push for harmonization, they're not just going to rubber stamp everything.
No, they still need to do their due diligence and make sure every product meets their standards. But what harmonization does is help to make those reviews more consistent
Oh, I hope so.
by establishing clearer and more aligned expectations for the type and quality of data that companies need to provide.
So everybody's on the same page about what good science looks like.
Exactly. Which can lead to more predictable review timelines, which is helpful for everyone involved.
So at the end of the day, no matter how harmonized this whole process gets,
Right.
the #1 priority for all these regulatory bodies is still making sure those medicines are safe, effective, and high quality.
100%. Protecting public health is their top priority.
And harmonization is just a tool to help them do that more effectively on a global scale.
Exactly. It's about working together to ensure that new treatments are both safe and accessible to everyone who needs them.
It's really fascinating to think about how these global collaborations and this whole push for harmonization are often driven by these huge global health challenges.
Absolutely. Like when you have a pandemic, the ability to quickly develop and deploy effective treatments across borders becomes absolutely critical.
And that's when those differences in regulations can really become a major obstacle.
It's true. They can slow things down significantly.
So in those situations, harmonization isn't just about efficiency. It's about saving lives.
It absolutely can be, and that's why these efforts are so important. It's about making sure those life-saving treatments can reach everyone who needs them, no matter where they live.
Okay, so let's recap what we've learned today.
All right, let's do it.
We started by looking at how all the different regulatory standards around the world were creating this really complex and inefficient system for drug development.
Right, a lot of hoops to jump through.
And then we talked about how the ICH emerged as this global effort to try and harmonize those standards.
Yep, bringing everyone to the table.
And we dug into the roles of the big players, the FDA, the EMA, the PMDA.
The key regulatory agency.
And how they're working together to make this happen.
Through collaboration and consensus.
We also looked at how harmonization affects the different stages of bringing a new drug to market.
Right, from those early studies all the way to the final approval.
And we talked about the potential benefits, like reducing all that duplicated effort.
Yeah, less redundancy.
And speeding up access for patients.
Which is ultimately what it's all about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we also acknowledge that even with all this progress, there are still some differences between countries.
Yeah, some variations are always going to exist.
And that those local regulations still matter a lot.
They do.
Yeah.
Each country has its own unique considerations.
And at the end of the day, agencies like the FDA and EMA, their top priority remains ensuring those medicines are safe and effective.
Right. They're the guardians of public health.
For everyone.
Exactly. That's their core mission.
So I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole process now.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a complex topic, but it's important to understand.
Absolutely. So for our final thought today, I want to leave you with a question to ponder.
Okay, I like it. Hit me with your question.
Given all the complexities we've talked about, the global health needs, the varying prevalence of diseases in different regions, and the local regulatory priorities that might sometimes be different.
Yeah, those local nuances can be tricky.
What do you think the biggest remaining hurdle in achieving truly global harmonization of drug approvals?
Wow, that's a big question.
And then building on that, what do you think a future with even greater harmonization might look like?
That's an interesting thought experiment.
What would be the key elements of such a system?
I think it would involve even closer collaboration between regulatory agencies, increased transparency and information sharing, and perhaps even more standardized approaches to things like data collection and analysis.
So it's about building trust and finding common ground.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but the potential benefits are huge.
It definitely is something to think about. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has been. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy exploring these complex issues with you.
And to all our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious about the world around you. Until next time.
See them.
Bye.